Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson, what's up?
Hello and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. This is Larson Hicks and I'm joined by Pastor Rich Lusk. It's good to have you here, sir. Welcome back.
Great to be with you, Larson.
Yeah, man, it's good to get back into a groove here after our holiday hiatus. So it was a great conversation last week. We talked about Genesis 3, and man, that really I feel like you mentioned Van Til and how every question he was asked kind of took him back to Genesis 3, and I feel like I've felt very Van Tillian since that conversation because I'm doing the same thing. Like every conversation, I'm like, well, really, you got to go back to Genesis 3.
Well, I want to let me jump in here and put in a plug for Van Til, because I think Van Til's probably always been widely misunderstood by both critics and fans of his. I think sometimes his fans really do treat Van Til's presuppositionalism as a kind of fideism. You know, we believe the Bible, we accept the Bible, and then that functions as our authority, and that kind of settles everything. But we can't really give reasons for why we believe the Bible. And then on the other hand, you've got people who are critics of Van Til who think that Van Til dismissed anything that might come from natural revelation, any use of reason. All of those are horrible misunderstandings of Van Til. Van Til actually argues for the truth of the Christian worldview from what's called the impossibility of the contrary. Nothing contrary. So basically what he says is, we can talk about all these different ways that we glean knowledge about the world through reason, and through sense experience and testimony that's passed down to us and so forth. We could talk about science, we could talk about ethics, we could talk about aesthetics, and so on. But what Van Til argues is that all of those things presuppose the reality of the triune God. You can only make sense of them if the triune God exists. So it's kind of like, if I deny that God exists, that's like denying air exists. I continue to breathe. Right. I continue to breathe in the air, even as I deny that air exists. Those who deny God's existence are still dependent upon him in order to make whatever sense out of reality that they can. Which, even unbelievers by God's common grace are able to understand some things, certainly. So that's part of it. The other thing is Van Til does not dismiss natural revelation out of hand. In fact, I think one of his most, a lot of people read Defense of the Faith, which is a really good overview of basically the foundational argument for the Christian faith, that you cannot make sense out of reason, science, or ethics without presupposing God. But I think his work, Intro to Systematic Theology, is probably his most important work, because that's where he really talks a lot about natural revelation in relationship to special revelation, and develops all these different categories. Really, really important book. And you see that Van Til is not at all opposed to the use of empirical evidence or things of that nature in making our argument. And that actually factors into all of these questions about male and female and that kind of thing. What we believe about male and female, as we talked about last week, is not arbitrary. And God's commands for male and female are not arbitrary. They fit with the way God made us with our design. And actually, if we investigate carefully into what men are like and what women are like, our basic creational design, we see that it meshes perfectly with what God has commanded us to do. To the extent that it does not mesh, that's due to the fall, of course. So if you sometimes feel like as a man, those manly duties or commands that God has given to you are hard for you to fulfill, it's because sin has gotten in the way and distorted and warped your manhood, and same for women. But the creational design, the evidence of the creational design is very much there, and that's something that would be very consistent with Van Til to draw that out. So yeah, Van Til, any time any issue came up, it seems like Van Til always wanted to go back to those opening chapters of Genesis: creation, fall, redemption. Genesis 3 is unique because it's the one chapter of the Bible where you have creation, fall, and redemption all in one chapter. At the beginning of the chapter, creation is still pristine. Obviously, then there's the fall into sin. But by the time you get to Genesis 3:15 and God's passing out curses to the serpent and the man and the woman, God also gives out blessings and promises in that same context. And so you've got the promise of redemption. So creation, fall, redemption, all in the same chapter.
when you were talking about Van Til, it made me think about this thing that well, I'm reading the rise and fall of, or rise and what is it, the rise and triumph of the modern self.
Oh yeah, Carl Trueman's book. Yeah,
Carl
very good
Trueman's
book.
book.
Yeah, yeah,
And I feel like the thing that he argued, one of the important points he makes early in the book, and I think Rachel Jankovic makes the same point in her You Who book. But just this idea that like you don't actually have to. It's not even that, and I think this is what Van Til's arguing, that it's not even that you don't have to lie to believe something, or to act in a way that doesn't align with what you actually believe. As a matter of fact, most people don't really know what it is that they believe. They're acting in accordance with. I think Truman calls it the social imaginary.
mm-hmm.
It's kind of this. It's sort of the way that people see the world. It's kind of another word maybe for worldview, but it's not a worldview that somehow like where people have formally adopted any particular philosophical view. They're just living in accordance with kind of the spirit of the age, and you have to sort of, when you sit there and unpack it, you realize that this is driven by this philosophy that's been pushed for 50, 100, 200 years, or more. But nobody really actually knows anything about, existentialism or, I was kind of blown away by Truman's, there were some things about Cartesian philosophy that I had never thought about. Like I'm a big fan, I'm a big fan of Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, and he kind of pits, his philosophy, his respondeo, it's a mutabor. I will respond, although I will be changed. He kind of pits that against cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But there was something about, and I love that. I've always loved that. Hussey's kind of approach and response to him. But what Truman talks about is like the cogito, like I think, therefore I am, like how individualistic that is, and how he's really at the rock bottom. That philosophy is saying truth originates with me, like truth originates in my own head, and that's where we are. That's everyone looks inside for truth now, because
that's right.
And anyway, I just thought that was pretty profound.
Truman's book, you don't have to have read Rousseau or Freud or Marx or any of these, towering historical figures in order to be influenced by them, because a lot of the influence trickles down. And so we can talk about the social imaginary. It's basically the kind of what's in the air we breathe. What's the cultural environment that we find ourselves in, and that's going to shape us in all kinds of ways. And it can shape us in good ways if it's influenced by the Bible, or in bad ways if it's some foreign philosophy, some idolatrous philosophy. And obviously in our day, there's just a very toxic idolatrous mix in the social imaginary that really detaches people from reality. So one of the fundamental ways that Truman gets at this is he says that in the pre-modern world, everything was about objectivity. There's a world outside of me that I have to conform myself to. And now in our sort of postmodern existence, we have what's called individual expressivism. And so the whole idea is my feelings determine reality. My feelings dictate reality. Truth is what I feel it to be. And so I may have the body of a man, but if I feel like I'm a woman, then I am a woman, or vice versa. And so that's really where he goes with that. So basically he's asking the question, how did this statement that I am a woman trapped in a man's body ever come to make any sense? Because you don't have to go that far back in history where people would just think that's utter nonsense. No, you are what your body says you are. That's part of objective reality. It doesn't change. It doesn't depend on your feelings. And now, of course, feelings override everything. And that's not because everybody went and read certain philosophers who teach that, though they're certainly out there. But there's this kind of trickle down. So we can talk about the social imaginary. That's Truman's language. In politics, sometimes people talk about the Overton window. That's sort of the realm of what seems to be plausible or possible.
Sure.
Or actually, sociologists will talk about the plausibility structures of a society, the things that seem plausible or implausible. And as our culture continues to depart from the Christian faith, which has sort of been the touchstone and really at the core, even though obviously not everybody is a believer or has been a believer, the Christian faith has been highly influential. As that influence wanes, what happens is I think you're seeing people drift more and more from reality. God's the ultimate reality. So you cut yourself off from God, you're going to cut yourself off from the rest of reality. And what you end up with is this sort of transgender fantasy land where you can make reality be whatever you want it to be. There are no givens in nature. You don't have a given nature. Everything is plastic. Everything's malleable. You can make reality be whatever you want it to be. The problem is that just doesn't work in the real world. And when you make feelings your final authority, it always leads to disaster because feelings are not designed to carry that kind of weight.
Yeah. Well, and this is why.
Well, I was just going to say one other thing about that. When it comes to male and female, I think this is the single biggest thing we see happening in our culture today is there's this rebellion against any kind of objective definition of what it means to be a man or objective definition of what it means to be a woman. Matt Walsh obviously did his documentary, What is a Woman, on this whole thing. But the whole idea that as a man, my bodily reality as a man, my identity as a man, that there's a God-given set of obligations and responsibilities that come with being a man. And for a woman, there is a set of God-given obligations and responsibilities that come with being a woman. And those are not the same, that men and women have different domains in which they operate or different, the center of their life, the core of your life as a man is going to be different than the core of a woman's life. Your fundamental roles that you play and certain aspects of your nature, who you are, that those things are different, that's highly offensive today. Because again, we live in a culture where people want to pretend that reality is whatever we make it to be. And really what that means for the sexes is some kind of androgyny. There's really no such thing as a man. There's no such thing as a woman. You can be masculine if you want, even if you're a woman, or you can be feminine if you want, even if you're a man, or you can be some kind of combination. You don't even have to know what you are exactly. You can say you're some combination or no sex at all, that you're asexual. So, obviously those are all departures from reality. Those are ways of rebelling against reality. Those are various forms of idolatry. But that's where we are as a culture.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is an important way to set up our conversation again for today, because I think, and we talked a little bit about this last week, but how is this social imaginary formed? If it's not formed by formal study of Rousseau and Freud and Marx and these philosophers who sort of created these ideas, how are they formed? How is it that everybody believes these things? And I think what Truman would say, and certainly what somebody like James Jordan would say, is it's all about the stories. It's all about the stories you believe, the stories that you, somebody like Jordan Peterson would call them the myths. These myths are these, not myth in the sense that it's not true, but myth in the sense that it is deeper than true. It's a lens for understanding how the world works, and so. Or
philosophers would sometimes call them meta-narratives, kind of the big overarching story within which we see ourselves living. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what's forming our social imaginary, and so you've got Disney and all the different media, Hollywood, putting out stuff that sort of portrays a world through that lens and kind of helps flesh that out for people through stories. So, we could ask, have you read Rousseau? And nobody has read Rousseau, but you could say, but have you seen the Marvel movies, or have you seen Fill in the Blank? And I know all that stuff. And so I think what you're pointing to in Genesis 3 is the fact that this is one of those essential myths or essential types, essential meta narratives for Christians to grasp. God, I think this is what Jordan and Lightheart talk a lot about is, God could have given us a systematic theology. He could have said, hey, let me lay it all out for you in philosophical terms. But instead what we get is a Bible that's mostly stories.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
and this is like the story. This is the story, and Christians, because Christians don't understand it, don't see it, have boiled it down to a really, really simple propositional truth. They've allowed their worldview, their social imaginary, call it what you will, meta narrative, to be formed by other things, and so are very susceptible to all of these lies that are just in the air today.
Yeah, that's right. So the Bible is full of stories. It's full of poetry. It's full of wisdom sayings. Yeah. But also you can look at the Bible as one big story. From beginning to end, it's one big story. And the prophecy and the poetry and the songs and the wisdom sayings, all of that set inside of the story and contributes to the story. But the Bible from beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation, is one big story. We would say that is our meta-narrative. It's the true story of the world. It's the true story of God and his creation, the true story of God and his people. And so that's what's got to be foundational. And that's what provides the lens through which we are to look at the rest of reality, because we can say this is the big story we're living in. It's the story of God's creation, God's kingdom. It's the story of creation, fall, redemption. And so that's that's how it all fits together. So we left off last time in Genesis 3 talking about the sex specific curses in Genesis 3. So we talked last time about how the particular roles and callings that God assigned to the man and the woman are evident in Genesis 1 and 2, even before the fall. So, for example, the man's headship does not come in as punishment for the fall. It's already established before the fall into sin that the man is the head. There's, for lack of a better term, a kind of patriarchal structure that's set up in the creation. And of course, that's not at all demeaning. We see that the woman is actually the crown and glory of creation. She is the crown and glory of the man. So there's nothing demeaning or that in any way devalues her when we say that the man is the head. But they'll have different roles to play, just like in a dance between a man and a woman. In a classic dance, the man's going to lead, the woman's going to follow. They each have their part to play, and that's really a way to think about it. Or I talked about a choir. It's the creation mandate belongs to the human race as a whole, to men and women. But men, you can have men singing the bass part and women singing the soprano part, and you're never going to find a woman who can sing bass or a man who can sing soprano. We just have different parts to play. So to say that men are more oriented towards dominion and women are more oriented towards multiplication, that fits perfectly with our natures and with what we see in the rest of Scripture, including the curses that come down in Genesis chapter 3, where the woman is cursed in her relationship with her children and her husband, because that domestic household life is right at the core of who she is. Doesn't mean she can't do other things, but it's the core of who she is. And the man is cursed in the realm of work, productivity, and provision. He's cursed in the realm of dominion and subduing the earth, because that's at the core of who he is. So the curses touch us at the very center of what we are called to do as men and women. The curses are not androgynous. Now, one thing I like to point out is that you have these sex-specific curses in Genesis 3, a curse given specifically to the man, a curse given specifically to the woman. She's cursed at the core of womanhood. He's cursed at the core of manhood. Elsewhere in Scripture, later on in Scripture, we find lots of sex-specific commands that have to do with our sanctification. Yeah. So when we talk about men and women growing in virtue and holiness and Christ-likeness, that does not look identical in a man and in a woman. It's going to look different. For a godly man is going to manifest his godliness in masculine ways. A godly woman will manifest her godliness, her Christ-likeness, her virtue in feminine ways. And so if you've got, so just to take one very well-known example, in Ephesians chapter 5, when Paul is giving commands about marriage, he gives certain commands to the man as the husband and as the head, as the Christ figure in the relationship, and he gives another set of commands to the woman as the church figure in the relationship. And so the man is commanded to do things like to love and cherish and nourish his wife, and she's commanded to do things like submit, obey, and respect. So different commands, and of course it's pointed out again and again that these are complementary. God commands the commands that God gives to the man and the woman are complementary. God commands women to respect their husbands because men thrive on respect. And God commands husbands to love their wives because what a woman needs more than anything is to be loved and cherished by her husband. So there's a fittingness, again, to these commands. There's nothing arbitrary about it. So I think that's really, really important to understand.
Yeah, when we talk about Christ, this is one of those questions that could get me in trouble, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. But we talk about Christ-likeness for women. I certainly would argue and believe that women need to be Christ-like. But there's also women also need to be church-like. They
Exactly.
need to be bride of Christ-like.
Right.
Like their model is the bride of Christ. And so there's obviously aspects of Christ's character that they're imitating as well. But we're told in Scripture that man is the image and representative essentially of Christ, that men, and that's why men don't cover their heads, and women are the image and glory of their husbands. So that there is. So I think that we don't see that as. I don't know if you've read Becca Merkel's book, Eve in Exile.
Yeah, that's a great book.
But yeah, so she talks a lot about this idea that one of the most glorious things about Christ is that Christ was an equal to God, and yet didn't consider himself as an equal, but submitted himself to God, and that submission is a glorious thing.
That's right. Yeah, there's a kind of Trinitarian model, and I think if you want scriptural support for this, you could go to 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul actually says God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of man, man is the head of woman. So there's kind of this, I don't want to say chain of command, that doesn't quite capture it, but there is a kind of hierarchical set of relationships there. So yes, Jesus as the eternal Son of God is equal to his Father, and yet willingly and lovingly submitted himself to his Father to fulfill the mission that his Father gave to him. In the same way, the woman is equal to the man, if we're talking about worth and value, but she's different in her calling, and so out of love and respect towards her husband, she's to submit to his leadership. And in doing so, according to 1 Corinthians 11, I would say the man-woman relationship, the husband-wife relationship, actually is patterned after and revelatory of the Trinitarian relationship of the Father and the Son. So it's really interesting. In 1 Corinthians 11, the wife's submission to her husband's headship manifests the Trinity in some way.
Right.
In Ephesians chapter 5, the wife's submission to the husband's headship manifests the Christ church relationship. That's what we usually focus on, and I think with good reason. But both I think are in play when we talk about submission. And then you can see that submission is really not degrading. It's submission. It's getting on board with your husband's mission and helping him to fulfill his mission. So another way you see this in the early chapters of Genesis, of course, the man names the woman, and she accepts. In fact, he does so twice, once before the fall and again after the fall. And before the fall, there's this naming, which indicates, again, his authority over her before the fall into sin. After the fall, when he names her Eve, mother of the living, that's indicating this is what her role will be. Motherhood, which we'll come back and talk about more in just a minute, but mother of the living, that they've just brought death into the world through their sin, but she's going to be the mother of the living, which means that they have accepted God's promise. They are trusting in God's redemptive promise that he will send one who will crush the skull of the serpent and who will reverse the effects of the fall. So it's really a glorious thing there. And the woman, of course, will have her role to play in this work of redemption, which, of course, ultimately you see with Mary giving birth to the Messiah. But then at the end of 1 Timothy chapter 2, when Paul says women will be saved through the childbirth, I think that is a reference to Mary giving birth to the Messiah, the woman's role as the mother of the Christ bearer. But I think also it's a way of saying when women stick with the vocation God has assigned to them in Scripture and in nature, then they are not as prone to wander off into sin and recapitulate the fall of the first woman into sin. So, here's a way to think about what happens in Genesis 3. And I touched on this last time, but I want to develop it a little bit more. When the woman falls into sin, you could say in a way she becomes, she's deceived by the serpent. The serpent is still deceiving women today. He's still telling lies that women fall for. And one of those lies, those lies can lead to discontentment. One of those lies is that God does not have your best interest in view, or your husband does not have your best interest in view. With the command, because we know that He had commanded her to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God gave that command to Adam before He created the woman, so that's the only way she could learn it is from Him. But you could say Eve really becomes the first feminist. Adam becomes a kind of male chauvinist pig, as Jim Jordan has put it, because he just stands by and watches all this unfold. He becomes an effeminate, abdicating man who really is no man at all. He emasculates himself. Instead of going to war with the serpent, he just stands by and watches. So just as the man and the woman in their sanctification are to complement one another, so he's growing in godlike godlike masculinity, or we could say Christ-like masculinity. She's growing in church-like femininity, to go back to what you said earlier, Larson. You have the perversion of that in both ways in Genesis chapter 3. She no longer acts like the feminine, submissive bride that she's supposed to be. She takes the initiative and she grabs hold of the fruit and then gives some to him. Okay, so she becomes sort of the pastor of this church where she's handing out the elements for the sacred meal. And he becomes this, this passive, effeminate shell of a man. Now, here's the thing. She becomes the first feminist. He becomes the first chauvinist. I would say that, in our culture today, we've got, you got kind of the alphabet soup of sexual perversion, LGBTQ, and all that goes with that. I really think if we really want to understand the LGBTQ movement and what's going on with all of this sexual confusion in our culture, you have to put an F in front of it for feminism. Feminism is the original transgender movement. I think it's feminism that, through opening the door to the sexual revolution, gave us, in many ways, the gay and lesbian movement. But I think now you're seeing that trickle down to transgenderism. So I say, instead of talking about LGBTQ, we need to talk about FLGBTQ. Okay, so FLGBTQ. So I know F sometimes gets used in other ways as just an abbreviation, but you get where I'm coming from with this. I mean, feminism is at the source of this. It's at the root of this. Okay, so FLGBTQ. What do I mean by that? Well, feminism is all about role reversal and androgyny. It's about trying to get men to sing soprano. It's trying to get women to sing bass. That's really what it's about. It's not enough to be a part of the same choir. It's that the roles have to be reversed. And so it has created all kinds of confusion. And I think you're seeing that confusion start to play out. It's in slow motion. So if you're not really paying attention, it may not, you can miss certain things that are going on. But you're seeing all kinds of confusion now play out. And I think what's happening, especially with young women today, is young women have been, in many cases, greatly radicalized. And this is the ultimate outworking of feminism in our society. So there was an article actually that just came out the other day, and I'm drawing a blank on the name of it, but basically it was sort of, what's the end game with the single woke female that now is so common. Women who are not married have no interest in marriage, little to no interest in children, totally focused on their careers. And these are women who are mostly in their 20s and 30s, but maybe also into their 40s. But if you look at, say, for example, voting patterns, married men and women both tend to vote conservative. Okay, single men tend to vote conservative. Single women, more than any other group, skew hard to the left, towards progressivism. And this is something to really keep an eye on, because what you have is now a group of women who have been told that marriage is this oppressive institution. They want nothing to do with it. They want to live sexually libertine lifestyles because they think that's truly empowering. They want to be able to dress immodestly and then accuse men of objectifying them. So there's a lot of, they're totally focused on their careers, thinking that's what's going to fulfill them, and that children would just get in the way of that. So they don't want children. And you're going to see, as this group gets older, you're going to have a lot of women. Scott Yenner actually has addressed this too. I can't even remember who wrote the article that I'm referencing, and maybe we can put it in the show notes if people want to take a look at it. But Scott Yenner also has addressed this pretty extensively as well. The misery of modern woman. She's been sold a bill of goods. She's been fed this lie that living an independent, marriage-free, child-free life of sexual libertinism focused on her career is going to make her happy. And maybe there's oftentimes when we get what we think we wanted, when we go for Satan's temptation, there's a kind of momentary fulfillment, and it might be for a lot of these women in their 20s and into their 30s, they are happy, or they think they're happy. But as they get older and their career's not so fulfilling anymore, and they start to realize that the biological clock is ticking and they've missed the window on their fertility, and now children are not going to be a possibility for them, there's a lot of misery that begins to set in. And this is something that I think if we as shepherds, I'm a pastor, you're an elder, we as shepherds in the church need to be teaching and even warning women about, because you talked about the social, this is the social imaginary we live in, that the fulfilled life for a woman today is a life independent of a man, not dependent upon a man in any kind of way, focused on career. Children are perhaps a life accessory if you want them later on, but probably going to get in the way of what makes you most fulfilled. And so it's really a rebellion against motherhood. It's a rebellion against being a wife and all that comes with marriage, but it's also a rebellion against motherhood. It's a rejection of that name Eve, mother of the living.
So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, because I think this is a really helpful thought, and I don't know if the exegesis is accurate, but I'm gonna throw it out there and see what you think. I read an article recently talking about that First Timothy verse that she'll be saved through that women will be saved through childbearing, if they continue in faith, love, holiness, with self-control. So there's a pastor or a professor at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Andreas Kostenberger.
I'm familiar with him.
And he looks at that word "saved" there, and it's not the word that we see in the New Testament for salvation in the sense that justification and faith and that sort of thing. But it's actually it's the word sozo, which means to keep safe and sound, rescue from danger or destruction, or to preserve. And so his reading of that passage is essentially women will be spiritually preserved or protected from Satan by adhering to their God-ordained role related to the family and the home. So that's his reading of that passage in First Timothy, and it seems to me to really, if read through that lens and understood that way, I think it provides a lot of clarity to to the rest of Timothy. Keep a close watch on yourself and on teaching. Persist in this, for by so doing you will save both yourself and your hearers. And just New Testament teaching on not permitting a woman to teach and things like that. It's alluding back to this concept that you are saved, you are fulfilled, you are going to be kept from grave temptation and danger by adhering to God's ordained design for
Yeah, I think that's right. So I would actually say that there's a little bit. I think Kostenberger's right. I would say there's a little bit more going on there, and this is why. And I'll just read the verse. This is King James. Notwithstanding, this is 1 Timothy 2:15. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety. A couple interesting things here. One, she shall be saved if they continue. So a shift from the singular she to the plural they, to women in general. Also, in childbearing, actually in the Greek, it is in the childbirth. It's got the definite article there. So I think the first part of the verse there is redemptive historical. It's talking about the woman's role in redemptive history. A woman brought, a woman sinned first, you could say. Now, obviously, Adam was sinning right alongside her, but she's the first to eat of the fruit, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the woman's going to have a role to play in redemption as well, in that she is going to be the one who bears the Messiah into the world. So this goes back to Genesis 3:15, what we talked about last time, the seed of the woman. The woman will give birth to a seed. And all throughout the Old Testament really in a lot of ways is the story of the seed of the woman being preserved. So the woman and her seed. So for example, it's so interesting right after this promise that the woman is going to give birth to a deliverer, a new Adam, a Messiah in Genesis 3. What happened? We'll skip over the Cain and Abel story, even though that's very relevant to this too. But as you read through Genesis, you keep running into these women who are barren. All the patriarchs of all the patriarchs' wives in Genesis are barren. Well, that can't just be a coincidence. That's just too strange. Just be a coincidence. Satan is stopping up their wombs because he doesn't want the seed of the woman to come into the world. And so again and again, God gives a miraculous birth to the woman, and the seed line is preserved. So these are women who are saved through the childbirth because they keep the messianic line going. At some point in the future, this child's going to be born, but you have to get there. So you have to have generations continue. You have to have women giving birth. In the book of Exodus, the attack shifts to the seed himself, and Pharaoh wants to kill all the baby boys. So now it's not barrenness, but it's it's not an attack on the woman's womb, but the fruit of the womb. So the baby boys are supposed to be put to death. And of course, it's the Egyptian midwives who lie to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh has become a serpent figure. Okay, the serpent deceived the woman in the garden. Well, now the Egyptian midwives fight back using deception. So woman was deceived. Now woman becomes the deceiver. That's justified righteous deception to protect those baby boys. But then you continue on in the Old Testament. There's this constant attention paid to genealogies, paid to and of course the line narrows down. We go from obviously the whole nation of Israel chosen to be the one through whom the promised seed would come, down to the tribe of Judah and so forth. But then, of course, it all comes down to Mary. And maybe you've seen that meme that goes around, especially during Christmas time, and you've got Eve, and she's got her hand on the pregnant belly of Mary, and then Mary is stepping on the serpent. And I think that's a really lovely picture of what 1 Timothy 2:15, the first part of the verse, is talking about. The woman played a special, unique role in the fall, and the woman will play a special, unique role in salvation. So it's not that Mary becomes some kind of co-mediator, co-savior, something like that. Roman Catholics obviously have taken that way, in a very anti-biblical way. But she does play a role in redemptive history in the salvation of the world. But then Mary then becomes the model for women. And so that's where I think then Kostenberger is right. Obviously, now that the Messiah has come, we're not awaiting the childbirth. Genesis 3:15, the seed of the woman has come. But what does that mean now? Well, in general, not that there aren't exceptions to this, because certainly there are some women who are just like some men who are gifted with celibacy and who are called to a celibate or single life without marriage and children. In general, for the vast majority of women, the way that they can grow in sanctification, the way that they can be preserved from rebelling in the kinds of ways that Eve rebelled in the beginning, is to stick very close to this calling to devote themselves to being wives and mothers. And so you see that in passages like Titus chapter 2. Titus chapter 2 is really interesting because it tells us what the role of the woman is. Titus 2, older women are to teach younger women. This is Titus 2 picking up in verse 4. Older women are to teach the younger women to be sober. So, moms who are obsessed with drinking wine to numb themselves to the fact that they don't like being mothers, which you hear so much about today, that's not necessarily a good thing. Obviously, a glass of wine is fine, but you need to stay sober. So older women are to teach younger women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, so to dress in beautiful but modest ways, to be keepers at home, that's a key one, to be homemakers or keepers at home, so to devote themselves to the household, to the good of the household, the well-being of the household, to be good, to be obedient to their husbands. That's obviously very offensive, the fact that a woman would have to be obedient to her husband, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. Because if a woman departs from these instructions, it's going to lead to the word of God being blasphemed. So we could debate what kind of content fills in. What does it mean to be a homemaker or a keeper at home? Obviously, what it means to be a keeper at home in 2022 is different from 1822 or 522 or what have you, because what happens in our households has shifted. But obviously, children are in the household, so that's a big part of it. There's always work to be done to maintain the household finances and cleanliness and order and whatnot. Those are all things that women are commanded to give themselves to. They're to be domestic in this way. Now, some people say, well, does that mean that a woman can never have a job outside of the home? And I would say, no, that's not. It doesn't say that. To be a keeper at home does not necessarily rule out various pursuits that might take her outside of the home, but the home is always the center and her priority. The household always takes precedence over everything else in the woman's life. So this whole idea that the man goes out to make a living, to provide for the family, and she manages the home and oversees the home as sort of her domestic environment, that's an entirely biblical division of labor between a husband and wife. And obviously the details of that, the specifics of that can vary from couple to couple and from one time and place to another time and place. But that's the basic pattern given us in Scripture. And I think it's really, really important. Now, I want to add a few more things to this because I think there's a lot more that can be said about this. But another way that you see this, I would say, feminist rebellion happening is in the woman's rebellion against the home. And against being a homemaker. And so you see lots of jokes. Oh, you just want me barefoot and pregnant, that kind of thing. Or, jokes about the woman's place is in the kitchen, or go make me a sandwich kind of stuff. Okay. And obviously got to keep our sense of humor about these things. But there's this obvious rebellion against that kind of calling as if it's not something glorious. Well, in reality, the home is glorious. And this is where I think G.K. Chesterton can really, really help us. Chesterton, and I know there's issues you can raise with Chesterton. He became a papist, which I don't like. He certainly did not understand Calvinism well. There's a lot of things about Chesterton that you could criticize. But his writings on home and family life, I think, are really, really fun, enjoyable, and generally on point. There's actually a collection of essays that was put out several years ago, I think by Ignatius Press, called Brave New Family, which is really, really good. But so Chesterton makes points like this, and I'll just throw a few of these out to you. He says, think about this. The woman who is devoted to being a wife and a mother, the Titus 2 type woman, who is committed to loving her husband, loving her children, being obedient to her husband, being a keeper at home. What does that mean? Chesterton says, why is it considered liberating for a woman to obey a boss, but considered degrading for her to have to obey her husband? The reality is that if she were to die tomorrow, her boss would find a replacement right away. Yeah. But her husband and her children would never replace her. There would always be a hole there in their lives. She's so much more valuable at home than at work. It's just like Satan has. This is a satanic deception where women have been led to think, oh, I'm more important at work than I am at home, when in reality it's just the opposite. You're easily replaceable at work. you're irreplaceable at home. Why do you think it is glorious and liberating to submit to a boss while it would be degrading to submit to a husband? Why do you think that it would be that this liberation can be found in the office, whereas everything done at home is drudgery? Okay, that's just not so. Here's another example that Chesterton gives. Chesterton, well, he's got this line where he says the whole feminist movement is, young women saying, we will not be dictated to, and then going off to become stenographers, which of course we don't really have stenographers anymore, but a stenographer takes dictation. Okay. So he just points out the contradictions inherent in feminism, that the whole value scale has been flipped, and it's actually not nearly as fulfilling to build basically a business for a corporation to contribute that as it would be at home. Why, in the workplace, you're a few things to a lot of people, but at home, you're everything to a small number of people who love you and who you love. And so it's there's a lot of confusion there. And I think Chesterton is really right to point that out. And I would strongly recommend reading Chesterton. One other figure that I think should be read, and she is not a Christian, but she's got a lot of really interesting things to say, is Erica Commissar. Erica Commissar has written a book called, I think it's called Being There. And it's on motherhood. And basically, she is, as I understand it, she's basically kind of a secular Jewish person, but it seems fairly conservative, at least with a lot of her conclusions. But and there are things in the book I don't agree with, particularly her political proposals, which still are kind of career-centric for the woman. But in the book, she develops arguments based on science and sociology and psychology, and I would actually say also a good deal of common sense, where she argues that it's absolutely vital for mothers to be fully devoted to their children for at least the first 1,000 days of the child's life. So basically that gets you to 3 years old. Now I would extend that out to 5 or 7 or even further. I mean, I think there's a lot of benefit in having mothers who are not distracted by other things. I realize there's a lot of pressure in today's world to be a 2-income family and whatnot, but your children are more important than money. Your children are more important than stuff, and so make them the priority. But what Commissar says is that a lot of the problems we're seeing as kids get older, psychological problems, relational problems, what might be called mental health problems like high anxiety or inability to bond relationally with other people. A lot of those things stem back to the fact that there's a mother hunger that was never satisfied in the child's life. And it's because the mother, took maternity leave and then started dropping the kid off at daycare so she could go back to work right away. And so Commissar actually goes into the details of the research that's been done on daycare and how harmful it can be. Now, I'm not trying to make anybody feel guilty here. If you're in a situation where you've had no choice but to put your child in daycare, okay, we trust God to be merciful in such situations and compensate for what is lacking. But as a general rule, daycare is a disaster. No daycare worker can ever love and nurture and discipline and teach a child the way a mother can. Yeah. And we just need to be honest about that. The culture will not let us be honest, but we have to speak the truth in the face of lies. Yeah. And the truth is, there's no daycare worker who's going to do for your child what a mother can do. So in those foundational years, what I would say is motherhood with small children is not the kind of thing that can be outsourced to anybody else. And it's not the kind of thing that can be easily combined with something else. Women today say, I want to have it all. I want to have, the kids and the family, the beautiful family and all that. And I want to have the high-powered, successful career. Well, the reality is you can't have it all. That's one of those satanic lies. You cannot have it all. You have to make choices. Yeah. You have to make trade-offs. That's just how it is. you cannot have it all, at least not at the same time. Maybe you can raise your kids, and then once they're grown, you can go, pursue a career then or something like that. But you cannot have everything all at the same time. And you have to face the limitations of that. And you have to be honest about how demanding motherhood is. We see mothers all the time. Women today will complain, oh, it's so hard because I've got to watch the kids and I've got to do all this for work and I've got to, do the chores around the house, and my husband, maybe helps a little bit, but not much. And there's all this other stuff I would just say, well, stop doing it. Nobody put a gun to your head and said you had to choose to live this way. Just stop it.
Right.
Most of those things you're juggling, you should just drop them and focus on what is most important.
Right.
Which is going to be your husband and your kids. It's going to be your household. It's not going to be your work, your career out there.
Right.
Focus on what's most important.
Yeah.
We can't say that kids are important and motherhood is not. If the children are our future, if the children are incredibly valuable, then motherhood is incredibly valuable too. And that means that mothers need to be set free to be mothers and to not have to deal with all the distractions or pressures of everything else that, that our culture right now is putting on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think there's I think the message that we have to teach here, that's so important, is really what you've already said it a bunch of times, but just to reiterate that modern women have been deceived. That feminists are delusional, and they just objectively are delusional. There's a YouTuber that I've started listening to her videos. Pearl is her name. I think her channel is like Just Pearly Things, but her whole thing is like, she just gets modern women on her show and she starts talking to them about gender issues, about dating issues. Have you seen this gal? But she's phenomenal. I mean, she cracks me up, but she talks about, her statistics are on point. She talks about how, 80 women view 80% of men as unattractive, and like some super high percentage aren't interested in a man who's under 6 foot, and that's only 15% of men, and something like dating apps, which is like how most modern women are finding a boyfriend or a spouse, that women only swipe right like 5% of men, which means like only 5% of the time do they deem a man on one of those apps as worthy of even talking to.
Women are highly, highly selective.
Super selective. And the funny thing is, not funny, but crazy thing is that at the same time, the rates of celibacy amongst and involuntary celibacy among men, that rate is just rising and rising and rising. So men are having less and less sex than they've ever had since like the 50s. And it's because women are really selective, and they're all sleeping with the same small percentage of men. So they view all men as terrible, but it's because the men that they're hooking up with are this small little percentage of men.
Well, psychologically, you're exactly right. Psychologically, this is what's happening. And see, so feminism and the sexual revolution go hand in hand. Okay, feminism is kind of the political side of it. The sexual revolution is kind of the social side of it. So, and both were all about breaking down not just norms for men and women, what's expected of men, what's expected of women, but also breaking down traditional Christian sexual morality. Right. And if you go back and you read the early feminists, they're very explicit about this, that they know that in order to, quote unquote, smash the patriarchy, they have to destroy the strictures on things like premarital sex. Right. And so the free love movement and feminism go hand in hand. Right. Okay, so what's happening now is that you have these women who may be very let's just say average women who will sleep with a very above average man. Right. And because this above average man has slept with them, now they think, oh, that's the kind of man I should be able to marry. Well, no, he had no interest in marrying you, and he would never marry you. He was just using you for sexual gratification.
Yeah.
But now the term the red pill guys use is alpha widowed. She's been alpha widowed. She has slept with an alpha, and she's decided that's what she wants. And because this guy had sex with her, that means that's the kind of man that she can get.
Right.
When in reality, her prospects for marriage are actually much different.
Yeah.
And it may not be the guy with, 6 foot tall, 6-figure salary, six-pack abdomen, that kind of thing. She's not going to get that kind of guy. And she has to be realistic about her prospects. But because a guy like that had sex with her one time, she thinks that she can get that kind of guy. And so it just really skews the dating market. So a lot of women have sort of priced themselves out of it because their expectations and all these other things are way out of alignment. Now, of course, as Christians, we would say, obviously, the most important thing is that you marry a fellow believer. You have to marry in the Lord, in the faith. And we would put a much higher premium on character. But we would also say these other things like physical attraction and whatnot are important. They do matter. Marriage is a sexual relationship. And so sexual attraction does matter. There's no question about that. We're not Gnostic. We're not denying the importance of, say, physical beauty or something like that.
Right.
But the whole dynamic between men and women has been destroyed. It's been disrupted by sexual promiscuity, by widespread fornication. It's just thrown things way off. So again, yes, now you have these women who have completely unrealistic standards for what they expect in a man, and then you got all these men who are, it's really like in ancient polygamous societies. People, polygamy, was so bad for women. Well, the reality is polygamy was bad for everybody. It was bad for men too. Obviously, women having to share husbands, that's far from ideal. The plus side is that they were generally sharing a really high status man. It was only really high status men who could have multiple wives. But just think about this. For every man who took a second or a third or a fourth wife, there was one man or two men or three men or four men out there who got no wife at all.
Yep.
So again, I don't know if this is really accurate or not, but supposedly the studies show that something like 60 or 70% of men who have ever lived have not reproduced.
That's crazy.
That it's actually less than 50% of men who have ever lived who actually got to reproduce themselves because there were not enough women to go around, because there were some men who took more than one wife. The powerful, wealthy men would take more than one woman.
Yeah, I think that the way I've always thought about the sexual revolution, it's obvious because I'm a man, so I'm hearing it through the lens of a man and thinking, man, men, we are such scumbags. Men are such scumbags, and the sexual revolution is just a great example of how bad we are. And not to take anything away from that. That's all true, well and good. But it's interesting that the deeper you dig into this, the more you realize, it seems like women have been far more deceived and far more taken in by the sexual revolution, and it's affected them very, very deeply. The other thing, this is kind of connected, but the other thing that's interesting to me is, well, there's a couple things. One, like 1 Timothy, we're talking about the passage, where women are saved through childbirth. But right before that, Paul's saying that he doesn't permit a woman to teach or exercise authority because Eve was deceived. The woman was deceived, right? And so it's like
the man was made first, and the woman was deceived.
That's right. And so it's like so this idea that women, it all starts somewhere. All these, again, nobody comes to these. You don't become a modern feminist woman by assenting to all of the propositions. It's just as we talked about at the beginning. But there's all these different pieces have to fall. One is that you have to become an authority, unto yourself in some way, and reject the idea that you can be taught or should be taught by a man or by scripture that's written by a bunch of men, right? I also found it interesting. I was reading in Genesis 20 this morning, and it's just interesting how frequently in Genesis God's stopping up wombs. It's just kind of a ho-hum thing. It's Genesis 20 at the end of the passage. It's the section about Abimelech, but it's like right there at the end. it just kind of in passing goes, and then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and the female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Mm-hmm. So it's just like this, you wonder. I mean, the Romans 1, that God's judgment is him giving people over to their sin. You just wonder how commonly when God sees rebellion in women, that he just gives them over and shuts their wombs, and that their sexual promiscuity and their lack of children is just, it's his judgment. I mean, they view it as their own independence and freedom, but it's really just God judging them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. There's this saying in Proverbs, and it's really about wisdom. All those who hate me love death. And that's what we're seeing in our culture, a rejection of God's wisdom, a rejection of God's ways, a rejection of God's himself. I said when you reject God, you reject reality. Okay, that's true. But when you reject God, you also reject life. Yeah. And you choose death. And that's what's happening. So you have people who, so they have fur babies and they count their pets as their children because they're not going to have any children of their own. Well, that's lame, pathetic, and stupid. Yeah. Having a dog is not the same as having a baby. You have not been fruitful and multiplied just because you have a couple puppies or cats around. Right. You talk about the social imaginary. Consider this. This was President Biden on Twitter. In the aftermath of COVID, this is what he said. Okay, it's a quote from Biden. Nearly 2 million women in our country have been locked out of the workforce because they have to care for a child or elderly relative at home. Okay, Biden was lamenting the fact that COVID drove women back into their households. They had to care for their own children and aging parents. As if this was some great tragedy or injustice. Yeah. See, if you operate on feminist, androgynous principles, if that's your presupposition, then anything men do that women don't is considered an injustice. Mm-hmm. Okay? It can't be because men and women are different and might choose different things. It's got to be because there's some sinister injustice at work. So, I mean, so there's a lot of examples of this.
COVID created a situation where children and elderly were cared by somebody who loves them for the first time.
Well, yeah, that's the way to look. And it's funny because I also saw articles come out about the time that all the lockdowns have been going on for a while. So a lot of articles come out talking about how much women actually found they enjoyed being at home with their kids. Right. It's like they discovered, oh wow, the household actually can be this good and glorious place. Okay, but several things there. One is, why is the government so interested in separating mothers from their children? Trying to push women away from the house back into the workforce. That's one thing that ought to make you very suspicious. Okay, another thing is the way this is framed is in terms of some kind of great injustice. Okay, but the reality is it's not an injustice. It's just it is just the fact that men and women are different, and we really do have different roles to play. We have different natures and different interests. It's the same kind of thing that you hear with the pay gap between men and women. The reality is there is no pay gap between men and women. Men and women get paid the same for the same work. It happens all the time. And the reality is, if a company could get away with paying women, say 75 cents on the dollar compared to a man, all a company would have to do is hire a bunch of women, pay them less, and put all their competitors out of business. Right. Okay, because if you could get cheaper labor, but that doesn't happen. And really, anybody who's a serious economist knows this, that the so-called gender pay gap it's a lie. It's a myth. It's just more lies that are being fed. But here's the thing: to the extent that there is a gap between men and women in terms of what they earn, it is because men and women make different choices. That's right. Men are more likely to go into more difficult STEM majors in college and pursue specialized type of work that requires many more years of training and then work longer hours. Yeah. Whereas women tend to want jobs that are more family and home friendly. I mean, you go back to Simone de Beauvoir, I think is the one who said this, one of the architects of modern day feminism, who said women must not be allowed the choice to be at home with their children, because if given the choice, too many women will make that choice. So again, the whole idea, we got to get women out of the home and into the workforce. That's the key, because that's what kind of does away with sex differences.
Well, and
You know,
that's
we can
what's happened.
pretend to be androgynous in the workforce.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's happened in the modern world is it has become so socially uncomfortable for a woman to stay home. She has to answer this question every time she goes out in public, like, what do you do?
What do you do all day? Where do you work?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's become so shameful that's essentially been accomplished. Yeah, one of the stats you hear, I've heard Jordan Peterson cite this a bunch of times, that I think it's Sweden is has been the most successful country in the world in being completely egalitarian in all of their policies and all of their schools and every way, shape, or form. They've been the most thoroughgoing egalitarian country in the world, and yet they show an even greater disparity, an even greater trend towards women, choosing the caring fields like nursing, and men choosing science and engineering. So in places where
they call this the Scandinavian paradox, because the Scandinavian countries have been the most deliberate and intentional in trying to train people to be androgynous. So we're going to eliminate sex differences when it comes to, say, education and parenting. We're going to do all we can to eliminate sex differences, and basically you're not a male or female, you're just a person.
I saw an interview
and then of course,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, So the thinking was, okay, when we do this, we're going to end up with, out of our engineers, it'll be 50% men and 50% women, and nurses will be 50% men and 50% women, and elementary school teachers will be 50% men and 50% women. And actually what they found, and this is why they call it the Scandinavian paradox, their attempt to create this, sort of egalitarian androgynous paradise completely backfired, because the numbers skewed even harder towards the extremes.
Right.
So given the choice, given the freedom, women will choose, nurturing professions, and men will choose more technical professions.
Right.
It's just, and that's and you cannot say that's an injustice. It's just reality. It's because men and women are different. One of the things feminism has done, and so this is a little bit related to the Scandinavian paradox, but it's also a little bit different. Feminism has had this tendency to take what were considered in the past male obligations and then to rebrand them as male privileges, and then to say, well, this privilege must be open to women. So think about the military. Okay, men have always had an obligation to be in the military. Not necessarily that every man needs to go into the military, but the draft. So if your country needed you, if you're a male, you could be drafted. You could be forced to go and fight for your country. That was a male obligation. Men had that obligation. Women did not. I remember during one of the congressional abortion hearings, a pro-choice congressperson was asking somebody, well, is there any, do we put any laws on men's bodies like you're wanting to do with abortion, and I'm thinking, the draft, that we actually force men to go to war. So, that's not my body, my choice at that point.
That's
right. It's not all comparable to abortion anyway, but that was the argument that was being made. But anyway, this was a male obligation. Women did not have that obligation. Okay. But then you had, because of feminism, women who said, hey, it's not fair that men get to be in combat and we don't. Mm-hmm. As if this was a privilege instead of an obligation that men had.
Right.
So we want to have access to combat roles in the military as well. And so then the military, because our military buys into this egalitarian, androgynous nonsense, these utter lies, the entire military has to be reorganized around the preferences and desires of a handful of women who want to be in combat.
Yeah.
And so we spend millions of dollars, and we have a less effective fighting force. I mean, again, all the statistics bear this out. It's actually far more dangerous to embed women in combat troops with men. It's very dangerous, very stupid to do, but we do it because of this egalitarian androgynous commitment that we have. And so what was a male obligation gets recasted as male privilege, and then women demand access to it. And then everything has to be reorganized in order to give women that access that they desire, so they can do, even if it's just a tiny handful of women, so that they can do what men have had to do. and there's a kind of craziness to it, and again, it goes against reality. And Scripture is really clear about who has the obligation to defend the nation. That it's an obligation that falls to men, and that it's shameful for women to have to enter into combat on behalf of a nation. A nation that would put forward its women to fight an enemy is not a nation that's worth defending any longer, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's pretty topsy turvy out there. I overheard I saw an interview with Rafa Nadal, the tennis player, saying the other day that they were asking, an interviewer asked, why do you think there's such a pay gap in professional tennis? He said, I don't really know, but he said, I also don't know why women models make so much more than men models. He's like, in the fashion industry, he said, but it doesn't really bother me.
And I know he got in trouble for saying that, but he's exactly right. I'll tell you why. It's because, the Venus and Serena Williams would be considered two of the greatest tennis players ever on the female side. And they both were beaten handily by the 200th ranked male player. I mean, you can go look this up. It's documented, and it was kind of just he said, it's funny, I forget the guy's name. He's so obscure. He ranked 200, but he says, I didn't even really warm up. And next thing you know, he's up like 6-1, he just dominates. And he's not near the as highly ranked as a man as they are in the woman.
It's shameful that we live in a time where we have to actually do that.
So or think about the.
Yeah, it's shameful that we live in a time where we're so delusional about this stuff that even is a conversation, and somebody has to go out and prove it because the social imaginary has been so effectively adopted by everyone that women literally think that they actually could beat a man in a tennis,
it's like the U.S. national women's soccer team lost to a bunch of 12-year-old boys. I don't remember exactly the age, but it was basically some teenage boys. Maybe it's a U15 team, something like that, and the boys beat the women's team. Or why the WNBA? Does anybody think there's any WNBA player that could make it in the NBA? No, of course. I mean, of course not. There's just no way. So, there's a reason for that. But yes, I mean, Rafael Nadal is right. I mean, if you go into, say, the fashion industry, then it's totally different. And there it's going to be women making way, way, way more money than men. And again, this just has to do with differences between men and women, and differences in terms of what we value, or differences in terms of the natures of men and women. So it's just the way it is. And it's not something we should fight. It's something we should accept as this is how God made the world. God made men and women different. We serve different roles, different purposes. We're designed and suited for those different callings that God has given to us. And that's the way it is. And that's very good.
Yeah. Well, my internet's dropped in and out a couple of times here, so I don't have my timer to see actually how long we've been going.
Well, it's been more than just a minute, but I'll tell you that.
What are we looking like? Okay. Well, I figured as much. Well, any closing thoughts, Pastor Lusk, on this topic of the glories of motherhood?
I think motherhood needs to be valued for the glorious thing that it is, and our culture does not do that. So you hear a lot today about the war on men. Warren Farrell and others have drawn attention to this, the war on manhood and masculinity, and there's no question there's been a war on manhood, a war on masculinity, and so men, boys transitioning into manhood today often lack confidence. They don't really know what it means to be a man. They don't know what's to be expected of them. All of their role models on commercials and whatnot are very effeminate type men, not good role models at all for them. And so men have a lot of confusion. But there's also a war on femininity. And that war on femininity, I think, especially comes to expression in this war on motherhood, this attack on motherhood. And I think it's something that the church needs to lead the way in pushing back against. The church should be a place where motherhood is honored and glorified and recognized for the wonderful thing that it is. And And women need to be praised and encouraged to pursue motherhood and to pursue being keepers at home or homemakers and using their gifts and talents in ways that serve the good of their household fundamentally. That should be the chief priority. So I think that's really, really crucial. I think in terms of where we go from here, Larson, I think it'd be great to come back at some point and do an episode on raising sons and daughters. I know you've done some Sunday school teaching on that, and I've done some work on that too. But because that's really the next question, I think, is how do you raise sons to grow into mature men? How do you raise daughters to grow into mature women so that you'll have a generation of men who will embrace their calling to protect and provide, and you'll have a generation of women who will embrace this high calling of motherhood, who will want to be wives and mothers and see that as a glorious thing. And of course, also, how do you protect your kids from these lies of the sexual revolution and feminism and the Flgbtq stuff, all of that. So all that's obviously really important.
Right. You know, something interesting as you were talking there, Rich, I was thinking about, and not, I don't want to overemphasize this, but I do think it's just interesting that the stakes, it seems like, for women are maybe even higher in the sense that nature kind of runs its course, and men, that whatever errors a young man may have, he's probably through hard knocks through life, he's going to start to, God's going to kind of beat him up and teach him those lessons, and he's going to eventually figure them out. But women have a biological clock, and if women really are preserved, saved through childbearing, if there really is an essential, part of their life that is tied to and tied to their holiness and their walk with the Lord, that's tied to their role as a mother. This war is being waged against women, against femininity, in the trenches with young ladies, especially, on social media and TikTok and all these different places. And so, if they can, if the world can capture your daughter's imagination for just a period there, of 10, 20 years, there can be irrevocable damage that's done, right? And we've talked about it from the flip side probably before on this podcast too, that a woman's kind of peak buying power, so to speak, for finding the best husband is a fairly short window. I mean, 18 to 30, that's kind of your peak buying power as a woman, because the physical is so important to men, that's going to be, that's going to be your peak time to find a spouse. And so again, coming back to this, like if your daughters can be, if their imagination can be captured by feminists just for those 10 years, then the damage that can be done, their options, after those 10 years, if they repent and come to see the truth, their options are going to be limited. They're not going to have the same options that they had when they were in that.
You're exactly right. And you're exactly right about that. For women, there is a biological clock. This is another one of those lies. What's happening now, I think, and again, this is just kind of a broad social trend. I'm not talking about in churches like yours or mine, where obviously, we still have much more traditional and I would say biblically formed sensibilities about these things in general. But women are basically taking the approach that they want to live this fornicating, partying, career-focused lifestyle right up to the last minute. And then right before that window of fertility closes, get married, have a baby, and then go back to the career.
Yeah.
And so basically, and this is why a lot of men have lost interest in marriage, because they kind of look at it as, well, women want to party, they want to sleep with that top 5 or 10% of men and that kind of thing for all these years. And then I'll just kind of get the leftovers, the scraps, once she's kind of, once the party lifestyle is worn out and her window of fertility is getting close to closing. And then, men sort of feel like they're just getting the leftovers. And in a lot of cases, that's true. Of course, the flip side of that is you got a lot of men who aren't aren't doing anything with themselves in the meantime. They're not doing anything to, if based on physical attractiveness, the stats you gave earlier are true, that most women are going to pass over, say, 90% of men if it's just based on physical appearance. What does a man do to make himself attractive? Maybe we need to go do an episode on attraction sometime. But what a man can do, because what a woman will find attractive in a man beyond appearance, is make himself a confident, competent, dominion-oriented man. And that doesn't necessarily translate into any particular income or something like that, although I think ultimately it probably will mean that he'll be much better off financially. But men who exude confidence and competence are attractive to women over time. And that's really, really crucial. So learn some skills. Learn how to grow in your own vocation and how to make the best of your talents and abilities. Work hard. Pursue excellence. And the problem is you got a lot of men today who have just dropped out of the workforce altogether because they just don't see any reason for it. So you got actually more women in the workforce today than men, which is just really a pathetic commentary on the state of manhood in America today.
It is. Well, there's 1,000 things to dive into here, and it sounds like we've come up with at least 2 or 3 future episode ideas. So I'll put them on the list. We've got I've been taking a lot of notes for the show notes, including some of your articles, Rich, that you've written on the politics of motherhood and in praise of motherhood. So we'll include those in the show notes as well if you want to dive deeper into this topic. But, sir, it's been a pleasure, as always. And, man, looking forward to our next conversation.
I am as well. Thank you, Larson.
The God a Minute podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you enjoyed this podcast, you might also like the Good Life podcast, where Matt Carpenter interviews historians, philosophers, authors, and more about how their work contributes to a good life.